These days, Nietzsche is one of the most popular philosophers, but modern readers usually don't know the context of his work or the ideas he was responding to. One of the things I've tried to do on the Nietzsche podcast is bring more attention to Nietzsche's influences. These are the writers that were formative on his thought and whose ideas shed new light on Nietzsche's significance to the long philosophical dialogue of the Western canon. So I've made a list of the influences that I consider to be most important for understanding the thought of Nietzsche. I've discussed almost all of these figures in their own episodes in the past. Which means if you want to learn more about one of the figures that we discuss here, there will be a link in the description. I will also give recommendations of what to read by each influence, my opinion on how relevant they are to understanding the thought of Nietzsche, and also how difficult their work is in my opinion. That way, you can determine for yourself whether it's worth it for you to dive into their writing. I also want to make clear that designating someone as an influence doesn't mean that Nietzsche agrees with them. It only means that Nietzsche responds to them. In fact, Nietzsche vociferously criticized many of the thinkers that we're going to talk about. And finally, this is by no means an exhaustive or comprehensive list. Nietzsche had an extensive library. This video could be 5 hours long if I didn't draw the line somewhere. I'm sure for those of you with a general knowledge of Nietzsche's work, the first influences that we discuss will be rather obvious, but I've also included some who are, in my opinion, under-discussed. For example, everyone knows that Schopenhauer influenced Nietzsche, but how many people even bring up Friedrich Albert Lange? So if you already know some of the notable and major influences, stick around for some of the deep cuts, and then at your next philosophy club meeting, you can be the cool Nietzschean who can explain even the most obscure references to other thinkers in his work. And that's what this channel is all about, expanding knowledge, which brings us to our sponsor for this video. You can't really feel secure about your data unless you know for a fact that it hasn't been compromised. But when there's a data breach, it takes most companies an average of about 9 months to report that breach to the public. This is more common than you might think. Last year, Citigroup and JP Morgan Chase both had data breaches, and when Bank of America had a data breach recently, once again, the public didn't know about it for months. If being in the dark about your data being stolen sounds like something you want to avoid, then you should check out the sponsor for this video, Aura. Data brokers compile your private information and sell it to the highest bidder, all without your knowledge. Legally, they are supposed to remove it if you ask them, but they make it very hard to do. This is where Aura comes in. Aura will inform you if they find your data anywhere on the dark web, and will let you know quickly if anyone tries to use this information to try and get into your accounts. They will also do the hard work of removing your information from these data broker websites for you. Free credit monitoring after the fact, the kind of thing offered by other services. It's kind of like installing security cameras after your house was robbed. If you have Aura on your side, they'll be actively on the lookout to protect your data before anything happens. And in the worst case scenario, they offer up to $5 million in identity theft insurance. Their app provides so many features to keep you safe and informed about your data, and if you go right now to aura.com/essentialsalts, they'll even give you a free 14-day trial. Within that 14-day period, they can tell you if any of your personal data is exposed. You'll know about it before one of these companies are forced to notify you months later. So don't take any chances with your data. Don't let anyone take advantage of you because you were in the dark. Go to the sponsored link, get your free 14-day trial, and let Aura keep you in the know. Big thanks to Aura for sponsoring this video. And now back to Nietzsche's influences. We'll begin with the most notable figures, the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, and then we'll move to the more obscure until we hit the bottom of the iceberg. First, Plato is indispensable for a thorough understanding of Nietzsche. Fortunately, or perhaps unfortunately, if you agree with Nietzsche that, quote, Plato is boring, end quote, basically everyone who pursues an academic study of philosophy is already familiar with Plato. Plato recounts the dialogues of his teacher Socrates, in which Socrates articulates a life philosophy based on the pursuit of truth for the sake of living a virtuous life. Whitehead famously said that all philosophy is essentially a footnote to Plato, and virtually every philosophical topic is addressed in the dialogues, from aesthetics to politics to epistemology, even a theory of love or erotics. Why is Plato essential? Because a central pillar of Nietzsche's work is a criticism of Socrates and the Socratic revolution in thought that occurs in ancient Greece. Nietzsche's philosophy establishes this contrast between the pagan values of Hellenic Greece versus the Christian values that would give rise to modernity, And Plato's philosophy is the fulcrum that eventually brings about this dramatic overturning. Plato, in Nietzsche's view, was one of the extraordinary people who legislated a revaluation of values. And that means, for Nietzsche, Plato is in the company of figures like St. Paul, who took the words of Jesus and formalized it into a doctrine, a religion, and accordingly rewrote the destiny of an entire civilization. Nietzsche implied that his project in Beyond Good and Evil was a struggle against Platonism, and later interpreters such as Heidegger have even interpreted Nietzsche's whole philosophy as a kind of inversion of Platonic judgments about reality. My recommendations as far as reading Plato would be The Republic, The Apology, or The Symposium, which, by the way, was Nietzsche's favorite work while in school. As far as relevance goes, Plato is S tier. He's as important as they come, and as far as difficulty, his work is about as easy as philosophy can be. As Nietzsche puts it, the contrived, wire-drawn dialogues can get a little tiresome, but the arguments are not hard to follow, and the dialectical format will probably make the text more approachable for most readers. Next up is Arthur Schopenhauer. His magnum opus, The World as Will and Representation, enchanted Nietzsche from the moment he discovered the work, back during his school days. Schopenhauer's work drew Nietzsche into the world of philosophy, and for many years he would have described himself as a Schopenhauerian. It was Schopenhauer's atheism that endeared him to Nietzsche, as Schopenhauer presented a negative view of life in which happiness is impossible, but without reaching for the promise of eternal life as a way to justify this sad state of affairs. In fact, Schopenhauer makes no attempt to justify life and thinks that the best thing is to negate life. That's the basis upon which Nietzsche refers to Schopenhauer's philosophy as heroic, even though he'd later sharply criticized Schopenhauer's pessimism. In fact, Nietzsche would come to reject Schopenhauer on almost every point, but just as in the case of Plato, the criticisms that Nietzsche makes and the way that he comes to differ from Schopenhauer are incredibly elucidating. Perhaps the most obvious example is Schopenhauer's concept of will to live, which Schopenhauer saw as the inner content of phenomena. Nietzsche would later introduce the concept of will to power as a competing view, though the Schopenhauer inspiration for the term is rather obvious. As far as recommendations go, the essays are the easiest way in to Schopenhauer's perspective, which you can find in a collected form in paperback, but you won't really get the full picture of Schopenhauer's philosophy unless you read World as Will and Representation. In terms of relevance to Nietzsche, Schopenhauer is up there with Plato among the most important influences, but in terms of difficulty, World as Will and Representation is a tough read, and you'll need to go slowly, parse out the arguments with some care. This isn't on the level of Hegel or Derrida or anything like that, but it's not easy by any stretch. So you'll need some determination, but if you apply yourself, you can do it. Next, we have Immanuel Kant. Some may find this surprising, but when scholars have analyzed Nietzsche's work and tabulated the number of references to other philosophers, Immanuel Kant gets more mentions than anyone other than Socrates, Plato, or Schopenhauer. Oftentimes in Nietzsche's writings, Kant is something of a whipping boy. Nietzsche lambasts Kant's moral philosophy as a simple recapitulation to the popular morality derived from Christianity. Only now Kant attempts to prove this morality with reason. In other words, Kant argued for what the average person already believed, but with complex and impenetrable argumentation that the average person couldn't possibly understand. Nietzsche called that Kant's joke. This dynamic is why Nietzsche said that the philosopher is oftentimes just a secular species of priest. He's like a moral shepherd who reinforces the beliefs of the herd. So understanding Kant's sort of position in the dialogue of philosophy will be very important for understanding many of those critiques. But Nietzsche doesn't just strictly treat Kant negatively. In a very important sense, Nietzsche is positively influenced by Kant, in that Kant's theory of knowledge involves the split between phenomena, which is the world as we experience it in the senses, and noumena, the world as it really exists, independently of our perception of it. Kant argued that we don't know the world in itself, but only the world as it appears. And in Nietzsche's early work, he even goes so far as to say that this development at least paves the way for the Dionysian, which we could define as Nietzsche's attitude of life affirmation, saying yes to the world. Because Kant had designated the truth in the highest sense as something unattainable, this eventually leads to the possibility of disregarding noumena altogether and recentering our focus on the world as it appears, which Nietzsche hints at in the aphorism, How the True World Finally Became a Fable. There's also a noticeable neo-Kantian bent to Nietzsche's early writings, for example, in the essay on Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense. As for what to read, Nietzsche read both the Critique of Pure Reason and the Critique of Judgment, but I'm not going to recommend these to anyone other than the most determined student of philosophy. These are not fun reads, and it'll probably be among the most difficult books you could attempt. In terms of relevance, Kant is fairly important for understanding Nietzsche, but in this case, you can probably get away with reading secondary literature or excerpts, unless, again, you're reading Kant as part of a broader philosophical study. If you want to comprehend the entire history of ideas, Kant is pretty much required, but if you're just trying to enrich your understanding of Nietzsche, it's entirely up to you, but just know what you're getting into here. Next, we have Kant's influence, also an influence on Nietzsche, obviously, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. That's perhaps Nietzsche's philosophical archenemy. Among all the writers that Nietzsche discusses, hardly anyone receives a more scathing treatment than Rousseau, but here, as elsewhere, there is a complication. Nietzsche shares many interesting similarities with Rousseau. They're both critics of the Enlightenment. They're both critics of the faith in endless progress and the power of the advancements in science and technology to liberate or improve mankind. But where Nietzsche saw the state of nature as a brutal place, the state of nature was an era of human existence defined by cruelty and irrationality and constant war, Rousseau believed that the state of nature was a relatively equitable existence for mankind, that tyranny and exploitation are products of civilization. Nietzsche argued that the yearning for a return to nature found in the work of Rousseau was itself a product of civilization, ironically. As with many arch-reactionaries of the era, Nietzsche viewed the philosophy of Rousseau as an ultimately anarchistic force that expressed a kind of resentment at modern society. So while Nietzsche shared many of Rousseau's criticisms, it was his differing picture of nature that led him to perceive Rousseau's philosophy as something like a catastrophe. Many of Nietzsche's comments on nature, his criticisms of the idea of a return to nature or of romanticism, this is all a direct response to Rousseau. For my recommendations here, I would suggest The Social Contract or Discourse on Inequality. They're relatively accessible. I would also suggest Emile, simply because it's one of the most important works of the Western canon. Rousseau's relevance is not quite as central as Plato, Schopenhauer, and Kant, but I'd say he's in the A tier, right below them, and meanwhile, he's an enjoyable writer, and most of his works are fairly accessible and short, so he comes highly recommended. Next, the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus. He is influential on Nietzsche's entire worldview, and he's one of the few figures about whom Nietzsche has almost nothing negative to say. We only know Heraclitus through fragments and from the statements that other philosophers made about his work, but what we find in those fragments is a philosophy of movement instead of duration, or of events, actions, instead of essence or substance, and a philosophy in which every apparent opposite is presented as relative, in other words, established by the vantage point of the subject. He famously wrote that one never steps into the same river twice, that everything flows. He has many famous quotations. Nietzsche at one point writes that he found no precedent for his great idea of eternal return, anywhere that he looked, even in the ancient world, except possibly in Heraclitus. And although Nietzsche does not directly reference Heraclitus at many places in his published work, there's a wealth of material in his unpublished notes and especially in his lectures, and the influence of Heraclitus, I would argue, just laces everything in Nietzsche's thought. As far as recommendations go, there's only really one thing to read, and that's the fragments. And they're not difficult. You can read them in a day, but you could think about them for a decade. It's very similar to the Lao Tzu in that way. The other thing you might check out is Nietzsche's own lectures on Heraclitus, or the sections on Heraclitus in Nietzsche's essay, Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks. Next, we have Baruch Spinoza. Nietzsche wrote in the early 1800s that Spinoza was his precursor. This may seem odd, given that Spinoza wrote in a completely different style. His philosophy takes the form of geometric proofs. He also put forward the idea of the intellectual love of God, something which might seem anathema to Nietzsche, who said that God is dead. But in fact, the intellectual love of God it's one of the things that unites Nietzsche and Spinoza, because Nietzsche would give great importance to the idea of amor fati, the love of fate. Spinoza's concept of amor Dei, the intellectual love of God, bears striking similarities. Both Nietzsche and Spinoza advocate for the embrace of one's life as it is lived. Further, both rejected the idea of free will and saw nature as governed by impersonal necessities. Both believed that morality was relative, insofar as nothing was good or evil from the standpoint of the absolute, only from the differing perspectives of various beings in nature. Spinoza's Ethics would certainly be the text to read in order to understand why Nietzsche called Spinoza his precursor, but admittedly it's a very difficult book, and its relevance might not be totally clear at a first glance. Furthermore, this book is difficult, and it should be said that Nietzsche in his middle period was very much aligned with Spinoza, but in his later work he makes many criticisms of Spinoza, mainly the sickliness of Spinoza and the effects of his philosophy, leading to resignationism, as he might call it. So it's a mixed bag as to how much Nietzsche would agree with Spinoza, quote-unquote, or approve of Spinoza, but he's undoubtedly a huge influence on Nietzsche's thought. Next, we have Blaise Pascal, the Christian philosopher. You probably know him for Pascal's Wager. This is another interesting case because he bears a great significance for Nietzsche at a certain point in time. Nietzsche mentions Pascal over and over again in his book Daybreak. That's his first book that constitutes a really serious critique of Christianity, and that Nietzsche said was the beginning of his campaign against morality. Pascal was a brilliant intellect. He was an inventor and a mathematician, but he had a religious experience one night and he became a zealous Christian. I mean, he was already a Christian by birth and seemed to be a believing Christian, but this made him a true zealot. And he, like Nietzsche, questioned whether the values of the Enlightenment could truly coexist with the Christian religion. He concluded that they could not coexist, and so he kind of sets out to circumvent rationality in the name of faith. Rather than appealing to reasons of the mind, he seeks to appeal to reasons of the heart. Nietzsche wrote that among the greatest crimes on the conscience of Christianity was what Christianity did to Pascal. He often talks about great individuals and argues that they end up botched and badly turned out, and Pascal is a perfect example of this. Nietzsche thinks he's quite literally a genius, but ruined by Christianity. His work, The Pensées, is really the key collection of his philosophical writings. That's the only work by Pascal that I would recommend. In terms of relevance, I'd say it's moderate. And in terms of difficulty, I'd say the Pensées are not hard. Although I would caution those who approach Pascal perhaps in two ways. Firstly, if you're not a Christian, the work simply may not be of interest to you. But secondly, if you are a Christian, or even if you aren't, you even begin to take Pascal remotely seriously, he could drive you into a state of existential crisis. Dr. Michael Sugrue once said that one of his friends described Pascal as an intellectual terrorist, and that's as good a label for him as any. Next, we have Niccolò Machiavelli. Nietzsche references Machiavelli a number of times, always approvingly. Now, Machiavelli is sometimes portrayed as an evil philosopher who told princes how to amorally dominate their populace or something like that, or others read him as a satirist or an ironist, writing words that he didn't really believe, perhaps as a form of criticism of the Medicis. I think that both of those viewpoints are fundamentally misguided. For one, Machiavelli was a republican and not a monarchist, and Machiavelli's main work, The Prince, states his explicit goals that have nothing to do with autocratic power, but instead involve the creation of an independent Italian nation that couldn't be pushed around by the Spanish and French any longer, unlike these warring divided duchies and papal states. Ultimately, Machiavelli's work is amoral, but it's amoral in the sense that science is amoral. Machiavelli is one of the first thinkers to approach politics as a science, and very little of The Prince has to do with advice for maintaining autocratic rule. Instead, it's mostly advice as regards securing geopolitical power. It's really a geostrategic book. As far as my recommendations, I would recommend reading The Prince. It is very short, it's very approachable, but if you're willing to put in the time and read the discourses on Livy first, you'll be in a much better position to understand what Machiavelli is doing in The Prince. These works are relevant for understanding how Nietzsche thinks about politics, especially in his earlier work, and most anyone with an interest in political philosophy can probably tackle this without trouble. You might have to occasionally do some research into the context of the historical events that he describes, but often no, he does a fine job of explaining the context himself, so he comes highly recommended. Next, we have a figure who is not a philosopher, at least not primarily, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. The relevance of Goethe's influence is another interesting case, in that it may not be immediately clear from reading Nietzsche's work that he is taking influence from Goethe's ideas, but we can definitely see the influence insofar as Nietzsche quotes him often or indirectly references his work. And Nietzsche loves to quote from particularly Faust or Goethe's Maxims, or else from his conversations with Eckermann. And Nietzsche called Eckermann's record of his conversations with Goethe the best German book there is. Goethe was a master wordsmith, and even though Nietzsche is somewhat critical of Goethe's ideas, he never really holds that against him because Goethe is first and foremost an artist, and he's a great artist. So a familiarity with Goethe's Faust is helpful, especially while reading Birth of Tragedy, and Goethe's attitude towards history is influential, especially on Nietzsche's untimely meditations. My recommendations are, of course, Faust, the conversations with Eckermann, or the Maxims, depending on what you're in the mood for. Next, Ralph Waldo Emerson is one of the most commonly forgotten among Nietzsche's influences. Nietzsche called Emerson one of the best writers of the century, and a number of Nietzsche's ideas are prefigured in Emerson's writings. Emerson advanced a philosophy that eschewed a justification for life to be realized in the future, or rediscovered from a distant past, or given from on high even. He rather centered his attention on the present moment. And even though Emerson attended the Harvard Divinity School, he broke from mainstream Christianity. He disbelieved in personal immortality. He argued that the average conception of Christianity that placed the incarnation and the Passion of Christ as a historical event in the distant past deprived itself of an immediate spiritual message. It led the congregants to conceive of the immanence of God as something long gone and far away, quote, as though God were dead, end quote, a phrase that perhaps influenced Nietzsche. I would recommend Emerson's essays, Self-Reliance, The Oversoul, or History. And like with Heraclitus, Nietzsche doesn't really respond to Emerson directly. It's more of an influence that's sort of an undercurrent. It's under the surface. There's a general impact in Nietzsche's thought that can be felt throughout his writings if you're familiar with Emerson. And the language that Emerson uses in his own writing is not difficult at all, but his line of thought can be hard to follow at times. Some of his sentences are kind of enigmatic. His work is best absorbed over time. It's something that you sit with, also like the work of Heraclitus. And another funny similarity between those two is the use of fire imagery and metaphors for describing their philosophy. Next, we have Michel de Montaigne, the French Renaissance writer who created the essay form. Nietzsche included him among a list of the best writers of France. He said that his writings, Montaigne's, should be held up alongside those of Socrates, or rather his moral teachings, and that this would be preferable for the moral instruction or the moral education of the populace that is offered in the Bible. So in the future, he hopes Socrates and Montaigne will be the figures we look to. Philosophically, Montaigne is a skeptic. He's constantly aware of his own ignorance. He approaches every topic he writes about with a serious humility. And there's no really overall philosophical project or point to his writings. He writes on every topic under the sun, across hundreds of essays, often including anecdotes from his life and wisdom from the writers of antiquity. He's intellectually curious. He's the opposite of a dogmatist, while still being very erudite, and he's very persuasive when he wants to be, when he tries to be. Above all, Montaigne is simply a great writer, which is why Nietzsche lists him along the 6 other great French writers, and I think even modern readers will find him enjoyable and relatable. As for which essay to recommend, it's too difficult to say. I would say pick up a copy of his collected essays and either start at the beginning or just pick one that appeals to you. On the channel, I talked about the Apology for Raymond Sebon and To Philosophize is to Learn to Die and On Liars and a couple other ones. But really, I wouldn't necessarily say that those are the essays you should start with. You could really start anywhere or just begin at the beginning and read through the whole collection. He really is a great writer. Nietzsche mentioned another Frenchman that I would include as our next significant influence, François de La Rochefoucauld. La Rochefoucauld's moral maxims is just a great expose on human action. He believes that virtually every act is driven by what he calls self-love. Even more importantly than that, though, La Rochefoucauld's style is very much the pinnacle of aphoristic writing, which Nietzsche would later adopt. That there's a huge stylistic influence on Nietzsche, not just his insights about vanity, about self-love. And by the way, in that same passage where he mentions Montaigne, there's a total of 6 French writers mentioned. I'm not going to talk about all of them in detail, but just so you know them in case you want to look into them, the others are Voltaire, Chamfort, Vauvenargues, and La Bruyère. And the reason why I single out Montaigne is because he discusses him in other passages, and with La Rochefoucauld, the style of La Rochefoucauld seemed to exercise the greatest enduring power over Nietzsche's writing. The moral maxims are a delightful read. The relevance in terms of the stylistic influence on Nietzsche can't be overstated, and they're not difficult at all. You'll definitely see much of Nietzsche's epigrammatic writing, his sort of maxims and arrows. You will see where he got a lot of that from, the inspiration for that style of writing. Next, we have the Hellenistic philosopher Epicurus. Nietzsche was, by turns, approving and judgmental of Epicurus. Epicurus taught a doctrine of negative hedonism, which is to say, the ultimate moral good is the reduction of pain, reduction of suffering. Primarily, Epicurus attempts to teach his followers how they can avoid their own suffering, and his answer is that it's mostly by living a simple, peaceful life. You should withdraw from the demands made on you by other people. You should give up on your personal ambitions for wealth or power struggles or for political power, anything like that. Nietzsche saw Epicureanism as a kind of Western Buddhism, and even though he disagreed that pleasure and pain ought to be the measure of the worth of existence, he admired Epicurus just as he admired Buddha for his logical approach to the problem of human suffering. There isn't much to read by Epicurus except his maxims and his letters to some of his followers, which you can find in various collected editions. His relevance to Nietzsche is much more subtle than many of these others. So I would say Epicurus, we're getting into the deep cuts of the influence on Nietzsche here. So I would say if you read Epicurus, what you'll really get out of this is it'll help you understand a great deal about Nietzsche's theory of values and his understanding of how certain kinds of values come into being in society, how he can admire someone like Epicurus for addressing the problems as they existed in his time. The world is becoming desacralized, people are not believing in the gods anymore, yes, even in the ancient world. Epicurus, in a way, can be seen as a symptom of the fall of Greece into a more rationalist epoch, and he offers them a way of not going totally into nihilism, even if his philosophy is still nihilistic in some ways, even if it's still sort of forestalling the inevitable. And ironically, the way that Nietzsche writes about Epicurus, it's usually in admiring tones, which is very interesting. So that would be his significance, in my view. Next, we have the historian Thucydides. This is a relatively minor influence on Nietzsche, but I thought I had to include Thucydides here because he calls him a representative of the sophist culture of the ancient Greeks. And he also calls him the antidote to Plato. So it's statements like these that elevate the importance of Thucydides somewhat, even if Nietzsche doesn't mention him a whole lot. And the impact of Thucydides on Nietzsche's thought isn't, he's not really a philosophical influence, he's a historian. So why is Thucydides an antidote to Plato? Because of his commitment to describe how things really are, without imposing moral judgment or political idealism. When Nietzsche calls him an antidote to Plato, he's really talking about our education with the ancient world, and when students encounter the writing of the ancient world. Plato is sort of like a poison, and Thucydides is the cure. Also, it should be said that some of the stories from the Peloponnesian War that Thucydides recounts, particularly incidents such as the Melian dialogue and the eventual fate of the Melians, these become very important in shaping Nietzsche's worldview. The history of the Peloponnesian War is Thucydides' only major work, and I'd highly recommend it independently of your study of Nietzsche, but that would obviously be the work that you would read if you want to understand the Thucydidean impact on Nietzsche's thought. Next, we have the philologist Jacob Burckhardt. Burckhardt was Nietzsche's friend at Basel University. He was an older professor who took Nietzsche under his wing. The two would go on long walks together while discussing ancient Greece. And among all the scholars of the ancient world, Nietzsche would later write that only Burckhardt was honest and unwilling to delude himself. For more than a century, Germany had been dominated by Hellenism, and many, including, for example, Goethe, had written of the Greeks as though they were a serene and cheerful people with a culture of higher enlightenment. Burckhardt, on the other hand, denied all of this. He suggested that the Greek polis was founded by extreme violence. They were founded as aristocracies that dominated the majority of the populace under minority rule. He argued that the Greeks did not possess the same notions of objective truth as we do, and far from being a culture of higher enlightenment, they delighted in cruelty, as well as in myths and sacrificial rites. This total picture of Greek culture was very formative for Nietzsche's view, and again, much of Nietzsche's project involves this contrast between Christian values and the ancient Greek values. Much of that comes, originally at least, from Burckhardt. Or rather, he was one of the only philologists who was saying this, in Nietzsche's view. Burckhardt's book, The Greeks and Greek Civilization, will be an enjoyable read if you're interested in the subject matter, that is. It's not very philosophical, however, and it mostly bears relevance for Nietzsche's view of the Greeks, for his philological career. Next, we have David Strauss, the author of The Life of Jesus, Critically Examined. Nietzsche criticized Strauss in one of his untimely meditations. But if we look to the biographical details of Nietzsche's life, it seems that Nietzsche's own atheism may have come as a result of reading Strauss's book when he was a young man. Strauss's book deconstructed the mythical claims around the life of Jesus. Eventually, the problems that Nietzsche develops with Strauss's work culminate in that critical essay. But again, Strauss is very close to Nietzsche because of how important he was for Nietzsche's early development. If you plan on reading Nietzsche's attack on Strauss, it's probably worth reading Strauss's book, or at least looking into his significance. There was a whole cultural firestorm that his book caused in Germany when it came out. I mean, seriously, people rioted over this book. So Strauss's work is not particularly difficult. You'll probably find it rather approachable. The thing is, I think many of the criticisms he makes are probably pretty commonplace these days, and his relevance to Nietzsche is rather, niche. It's only really relevant for understanding a really particular moment in Nietzsche's life. And while you can draw some broader implications from his disagreement with Strauss, it's probably not the most essential thing to familiarize yourself with. Finally, the last person I would like to talk about on this list is Friedrich Albert Lange, the author of The History of Materialism. Lange's presentation of the development of the materialist worldview was indispensable for Nietzsche. He also introduced Nietzsche to a number of scientists and thinkers, such as Boskowitz. I haven't included the work of Roger Boskowitz in this list of influences because it's a scientific work that I think would, in its old science, that many of us are not going to be able to understand, make sense of, and personally, I haven't read it, so I can't, in good conscience, recommend it. But in any case, much of what Nietzsche knew about Boskowitz actually comes from Lange. And furthermore, Marxist writers were included in Lange's compendium. Remember, they claimed to be doing scientific socialism. That's likely where Nietzsche was first exposed to many socialist and Marxist writers. Lange is not often discussed because Nietzsche almost never mentions him. But he had Lange's History of Materialism from a young age, from the time when he was doing when he first became interested in philosophy while he was teaching as part of the philology department. And his book colored Nietzsche's entire lecture series on the pre-Socratic philosophers. As far as tracking down History of Materialism in English, good luck finding it in a single volume. Your best bet is tracking it down in 3 volumes. Last time I checked, they're still very expensive. So this influence is only for the diehards. As far as relevance, this one's kind of a sleeper. The influence is never really explicit, but Lange presents a history of thought that really impacted Nietzsche's worldview. In terms of difficulty, it's moderate, but the length of Lange's project will probably be a little too much for most casual readers. But if you're committed, there's probably no one better to read to help unlock some of the deep lore of Nietzsche's philosophy. And that just about does it for this list of Nietzsche's most important influences, in my view. As I said at the beginning, I know there's others who could have been included. This is the point where I say, let me know in the comments who you think I should have mentioned, and Please give your argument why. Come tell me why I committed a crime against philosophy by not telling you to read Hegel. Let me know if you've read any of these books that I've mentioned and what you think of them. Hopefully this guide will help you either prepare to read Nietzsche if you haven't started or flesh out your existing understanding. So with that, thank you everybody. Thanks for watching. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.